Okay. So, dear friends, we're just going to be chatting around for around about 10 minutes on this topic, which is the first noble truth of the Buddha, and it's something that Thich Nhat Hanh, our teacher, Zen master, really talked deeply about the suffering that is in the world, and I think we can all agree there is a lot of suffering in the world. We only have to switch on the TV to see, for example, or go onto the internet and to see the amount of difficulty and suffering there is in the world, and that is individual difficulty and collective difficulty as well in the collective consciousness. And we want to look particularly in the suffering in leadership, and but to not to and it's everything's about balance. So in Zen Buddhism, so the middle way. So it's to be aware of the suffering that we have, but not to dwell in this suffering. Okay, and so it's kind of like looking at how do we do that? Because even the word in itself, suffering, it's kind of can be I don't want to talk about that, and that was my initial reaction when I started following this path like 30 years ago when my mum and stepfather introduced me to this. It's kind of like I don't have any suffering. I don't want to talk about suffering, and this is this is the way our society is kind of set up. So Thich Nhat Hanh reminds us that our society helps us to either run away from our suffering or to deal with our suffering through consumption. Okay, so and to kind of seek that consumption through kind of like pet pleasure seeking. This is how our mind works. We're not going to go into Buddhist psychology and how our mind works. We can go into that as we progress. But our drivers as a human species are fear, as we know, and the desire, the absolute desire to survive. But we're really driven, by by fear. And it was interesting that Smrti was talking about regrets, because this is he's just touching on that. Been talking about a brilliant book called The Five Biggest Regrets of the Dying just recently, and I looked at this book like 12 years ago, and it just reminded me of Smrti was saying there. And the first biggest regret of a lot of people on their deathbed is, I wish I'd have lived the life more true to myself rather than the life others expected of me. And that is society as well, what society expects, even though it might not feel right in our heart or in our gut feeling. We're swayed by our mind and the inputs that we're getting, because everything we take into our senses, nothing is lost, as we know through Buddhist psychology and through modern neuroscience. Everything we take in is stored, and that's who we become in the world. We're made through our genes, through everything we take into our senses, and what is what is in our consciousness. And so our environment. So our environment plays a huge part in this shaping of who we are, and then obviously our childhood is a blueprint for this, particularly our first like 4 and 7 years, as again neuroscience tells us. So what do we do about this? And in fact, actually, this week, just somebody on one of the courses we run, one of the women on the course is very bright, Cambridge graduate, followed the path of academia, and she said that when she said to her mum when she was young, she was sad. Her mum didn't know how to react to that, and her father didn't know how to react to that. And they said to her, "Well, what do you want us to do about it?" And it's kind of, she said, "I didn't want them to do anything about it. I just wanted them to hear me and hold that." And Thich Nhat Hanh reminds us, this suffering, we if we can, instead of running away from it, if we can hold it like a mother or a father holding a baby with love, this is how we want to start to take care of the suffering within us, and which we're going to go on to in the next few series. We're going to go through this path, but we're going to concentrate on suffering at the moment, and what we actually run into. So we run into, like, academia, we run into our work, maybe we run into chasing money, for example, to make us feel better. That's certainly the path that I went on as an entrepreneur, because I didn't feel good enough as a child. I didn't feel loved enough as a child, and I thought that this would make me accepted and good enough, for example, in business, and so chasing success, feeling seen, feeling admired, these things that, because we're actually lacking, I lacked inside, certainly. And so I also ran into pleasure seeking, ran into consumption. And I find myself, I have to check in with myself all the time now. And thank goodness this practice, I can come back to my breath, but it's still a strong driver that I see in my parents, I see in my ancestors. And when I go to surf the internet and I'm looking at stuff, and sometimes can be quite unwholesome, or I run into food. This is a real comfort. I like to go into the fridge and see and I have to kind of check in with myself. Okay, what am I really hungry, or am I just trying to kind of take care of my suffering? So it's really trying to be aware of what's going on for us. So we have these, in Buddhist psychology, we have all of these seeds in our consciousness, and we have 51 seeds in Buddhist psychology, and it all depends what we water in our consciousness, that what comes up into our being and our mind. And so if we're continually watering the seed of sadness or anger or anxiety, if we're surfing the internet, watching what's going on in the world, and we can't take care of that, and we surf too much, or we look at the news too much, this is continually watering those seeds. So we need this middle way. We need this balance of trying to be able to, as Thich Nhat Hanh reminds us, to cultivate these beautiful essences of joy, these beautiful essences of compassion, of kindness, of love, of generosity, of inclusiveness, equanimity, trust, respect. And if we can nurture those seeds within ourselves, then we can show up in the world, and we can really love our partner, our children, our family, our community. We can love and feel connected and have compassion for people that even annoy us. Maybe business leaders or politicians and what have you. Maybe we can look at them and have real compassion for them, so we can act from that place. And this is why Thich Nhat Hanh is our teacher, because he went through the Vietnam War with a huge amount of suffering and managed to come out of that. He was calling for peace when two huge nations were fighting, and peace made you an enemy of both sides. So a huge amount of suffering. He had to hold babies as they were dying. And so he came out of that situation with compassion and love because of this practice and looking deeply. So it's really concrete what we're trying to share with the world, and particularly in leadership. We see in leaders, and I was there in 15, 20 years ago, and I was powering forward with my businesses and that, and I didn't take care of my wife. I didn't spend enough time with my children. I didn't spend enough time with friends that I loved and cherished, or doing the things that I wanted to do. So I just mentioned, so looking at that book, The 5 Biggest Regrets of the Dying, for example, I was looking at four of those biggest regrets, thinking that, I would regret those if I had died yesterday, if this, 15 years ago. I read this 12 years ago. And now I can look at that, I can completely reframe it. I wish I hadn't have worked so hard. It was number two, and all of these things. So really looking deeply at our suffering and taking care of it, we can, as Thich Nhat Hanh reminds us, that right in that suffering, right in the mud, we can grow a beautiful flower, a beautiful lotus, and then really show up for ourselves, take care of ourselves, take care of our loved ones. And we see this with many business leaders. And I'm just going to finish off with saying that, we as a species, as Thich Nhat Hanh says, we need to change direction of how we think, from being so attached to the self and our suffering, to moving to a place of love. So if we can help ourselves and help leaders from the bottom up to really start to take care of themselves and not have this separation, which starts, for example, with our mind and our body. And I for example abused my body because I was disconnected from it. By bringing that together with our practice, we can really start to take care of ourselves, start to be connected with our body, with our feelings, with our perceptions, with our mental formations, with our consciousness. And the individual consciousness will help with the collective consciousness, and we can move. So all of a sudden, like for example, with myself, I was dealing with hundreds of millions of pounds, euros, dollars of investments in my businesses. Okay. Until I looked at this practice and looked deeply at where those businesses were investing and doing a lot of damage to the planet, I didn't look deeply enough. So this is what gives me hope, because if someone like myself can change completely direction to that, to follow this path, then others can do it. We can all do it. So I'm gonna finish there. Thank you so much for listening, and we're going to open this up now for sharings, to see what how that lands with you and your experiences. So thank you so much for listening, everybody. Bye now.